son. Where'd you find this?
Buckle up, buttercups. It's time to get down to business. Oh, yeah. It's the Totally Legitimate Business Podcast. Totally legit.
All right, folks, we are back here once again. It is the Totally Legitimate Business Podcast. I'm super stoked for today's episode. It's been months in the making. We have author of A Lie Too Big to Fail, The Real History of the Assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, and an expert on the assassinations of the 60s that robbed us of a true golden age, Lisa Pease. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I'm obviously super excited to have you. We've been trying to coordinate this for months now. I had originally reached out to you right before the most recent drop of the new JFK files, but I guess to give you a little bit of background, I have always been interested in the conspiracies surrounding JFK and RFK, and I come from a family that is not. I am certainly the conspiracy theorist in my family. Like, you know, my parents are not this way. My dad especially, but whenever they would tell me about this period of history, that would be the first thing my dad would say is, oh, that was clearly a conspiracy.
Wow.
There was clearly something not okay there. And most people in my generation, his generation, I mean, are like openly accepting of that now. And even, you know, they were then. But for context, when do you start looking at these pieces of history and start to think something ain't right?
Wow. It's funny because it was 1992, but it was, how do I want to say, most people who started in 1992 did so because of the film JFK. I didn't see the film JFK, but I was just coming off the Jerry Brown campaign where he ran for president, and I saw how much the media lied about the Jerry Brown campaign. And so I'm like, well, if they've lied about that, what else have they lied about? And I remember going to a garage sale and picking up like 3 books. 2 of them were on the JFK assassination, and one of them was on the RFK assassination. And the first JFK book I ever read was Plausible Denial by Mark Lane. And it opens, and I had just come off of volunteering with Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, where we learned to track certain journalists who were, you know, more friendly to the national security state versus the ones who are willing to take it on. And so I was very aware of like the CIA and the media even before I started in this. And so when I read Plausible Denial, it opens with a chapter on Priscilla Johnson McMillan, who was a CIA operative working in the media, who wrote a book, Marina and Me, which was about her living with, Marina Oswald, right?
Yeah.
And Marina later decried the book and said it was a pack of lies, which doesn't surprise me. And in later years, I just have to say this, in later years, I saw Priscilla Johnson's photo in the upper right corner of a tabloid, and it said, I slept with JFK. Now, she really did work for him when he was a senator, oddly enough, way before, you know, he should have been on anybody's radar. And, but, you know, he didn't sleep with her. This is just another lie. You know, people... Yeah. You know, I'm not saying he was faithful to Jackie, but I will say 90% of the stories of people who slept with him are fake, and provably so. So, you know, it's, yeah, anyway. But as I read that book, it struck me. It's like, well, if the CIA killed JFK, then they had the power to cover it up because of these CIA journalists that people didn't know anything about. And I read a great article by Carl Bernstein in Rolling Stone from October 1976, and he talked about the CIA and the media. That's the name of the article. And people can find it on his website, carlbernstein.com. You know, and the article's the CIA and the media. This is the Bernstein of the Woodward and Bernstein Watergate expose team. So, you know, very famous journalist. And during the investigations, there were 4 separate investigations of the CIA from 1972 through 1977. There was the Watergate Committee, which was deeply looking into the CIA because CIA operatives were caught at Watergate. And then Gerald Ford, Cy Hirsch wrote an article in December of 1974 exposing the fact that the CIA was operating illegally domestically. that's not in their charter. They're only supposed to be focused outward, and they were running operations inside our country against people who lived here.
Yeah.
And so Gerald Ford wanted to launch his own Rockefeller Commission. This is the same Gerald Ford who had been a member of the Warren Commission. So he knew that commissions, when you hear commission, you should generally think cover up, because I've looked into a bunch of them now, and they're all kind of designed not so much to give us the truth, but to give us a palatable story that allows things to continue, without too much damage. Exactly. And it was called a whitewash from the beginning. He was appointing people like Ronald Reagan and, other people who had been known to cover for the CIA before. And somebody asked Ford, why are you picking all these like insider and like a Rockefeller, David Rockefeller. And he's like, well, I need really trusted people. And they're like, why? He's like, because they might expose things. And like what kind of things? And he said, like assassinations. Now, bear in mind, again, this is about illegal CIA domestic operations.
Yeah.
And so having been a member of the Warren Commission and talking about assassinations, obviously this became a huge news story. And he tried to immediately say, that's off the record. But Ford, being clumsy, didn't get it in the right order. You have to say that first. And then what you say is off the record. You can't do it retroactively. So that launched not only the Rockefeller Commission, but the Church Committee and the Pike Committee. The Church Committee was the Senate Select Committee to study government, intelligence operations or something. It has a really long formal name. And the Pike Committee was the House Select Committee studying investigations. So there was and then following all those investigations, there was the House Select Committee on Assassinations. So anyway, I got super interested not just in the assassinations, but quickly in the CIA and all the CIA investigations. I read, huge portions of the Church Committee report. I read the entire Pike Committee report, which was actually published in book form in England because it wasn't allowed to be published here.
Shocker.
But I found it at the library and read the whole thing and even copied it for myself so that I would have it to refer to. And the things that you learn, it's like, the White House, at least under Nixon, the CIA had gardeners in the White House. The CIA had janitors in the White House because they could go through the trash and see what was there. It's like the whole White House was basically being spied on by the CIA. Now you have to believe that's still continuing. And I know, Trump has tried to take over the CIA, and I think that's just a fool's mission. They're too deeply embedded everywhere, and they're so secretive no one knows where they are. And he thinks by changing directors he can control the CIA. It just doesn't work that way because the director doesn't control the CIA. It's the mid-level managers who really control what goes on, and they only tell their superiors what they think their superiors need to know. And they will lie to their superiors. In fact, a CIA historian, I read about the Guatemala operation in a book written by a CIA historian with access to their inside files. And in his intro, he says, this is going to be my best attempt, he said, because I found the CIA, one hand would lie to the next hand. They would lie to each other all the time. So he's like, this is my best guess at what happened, but I can't be sure because they lie so often in their own files. And every JFK and RFK researcher should be aware of that. If a file comes out that says, oh, this guy never worked for the CIA, some people take that as a fact. I take that as well, maybe he did, maybe he didn't.
Yeah.
Because
consider the source here.
They would say the same thing. Yeah, exactly. So anyway, and then while I was studying, I also, because of these books, my first internet search ever, before there was, the internet had only just gone public that year. And my first search was JFK assassination.
Flagged from the get-go.
That one fateful search changed my whole life. I probably would have done a billion different things had I not made that search, but I found a news group called Alt Conspiracy JFK. And people were hotly discussing facts and theories. And have you read a couple books? I thought I was an expert. Ha ha ha. I jumped in and started talking about the things I had read. And this kind of faction of people led by a guy named John McAdams kind of descended on me almost immediately. putting me down, being nasty, trying to show that I didn't know what I was talking about. And rather than that dissuade me, that just angered me. So
Yeah.
I started digging in and researching more. And pretty soon I found there was a copy of the entire 26 volume set of the Warren Commission at a local library. So I went and pulled out a volume at random. It happened to be volume 5. I now have my own set. You can't quite see it here. There I go. It's at the top there.
Amazing. Just to make sure we've got that on record here.
Exactly.
Just to make sure.
But anyway, in this, it was Dr. Malcolm Perry who had worked on the throat wound on JFK after he had been shot. And as I read it, it was Arlen Specter questioning him, and it became super obvious to me that Perry thought that was an entrance wound, and Specter was doing all he could to get him to say it was an exit wound. And the style of the questioning and the manner of it was so intimidating and so crazy. I'm like, if any journalist read this, they would know there was a cover-up. Just this one interview is so bizarre, you would have to know that JFK was shot in the front if you read it, just by the nature of the questioning. And Arlen Specter comes up with a ridiculous hypothetical. Well, if the bullet traveled slowly enough, if this happened, if that happened, could it, under those, ridiculous suggestions, be an exit wound? And he finally got Malcolm Perry to say, well, under that hypothetical, yes. And then that became the story. Malcolm Perry says it's an exit wound, so therefore he was shot from behind, even though it was clearly an entrance wound. So, and there were so many facts like that I started to find. I ended up arguing in this forum for about 5 years, and then I started to get curious, because I'm like, it makes sense for me to be arguing because I'm arguing against established convention, but it didn't make sense to me that there would be these other people so invested in the cover story that they would spend all their free time trying to keep the lid on the conspiracy. And I thought, I bet these people work for the CIA. So I started digging into the backgrounds of the different posters, including the lead guy, John McAdams. And he had gone to Harvard. He was a PhD, but he worked for this institute called the Heartland Institute. And then one day he kind of outed himself without realizing it. He said he was the official representative for the ICPSR, which was the inter-university consortium for public and social research. And I happened to have read a book that had just talked about that and how that came out of the ISR, Institute for Social Research, which was wholly created by the CIA. So basically, he's working for a CIA-funded operation. I'm like, I have you now, McAdams. And he went silent for 2 weeks. The first 2 weeks he'd ever completely disappeared from the internet in 5 years, And so I thought, he's running to Langley to get instructions. And when he came back, it was as if nothing had happened. He just ignored that, and pretended that conversation never happened. And then he did that same sort of behavior one more time where I proved him wrong on something he was saying, that Clay Shaw, the guy that New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison tried to prosecute as being involved in the JFK assassination. In Clay Shaw's Who's Who entry, it says he worked for the CIA. And McAdams is like, oh, that's not true. He never said that. It's not there. And I'm like, I literally went to the library. I could take a photo of the page. It's like, it's there. He actually said that. And I found out because Who's Who at that point was writing me saying, would you like an entry? And would you like to, talk about yourself? And you have to pay for it. It's not like they go find, people and decide. They ask people to pay to join the Who's Who so they can be famous. And of course, I never bothered. But that means that Clay Shaw wrote that himself and said, I'm CIA on the public record. And anyway, McAdams conceded that point on this internet news group I was on. But I also was following one on AOL, a similar news group. And over there, it's like he started the lie from the top as if he was running a script. And that's when I realized these guys are CIA. They are professional disinformation agents online designed to keep the lid on this stuff. And that's why I decided to leave these internet discussion groups and go tell the rest of the world what I was finding. And I really haven't been back in the forums for that reason. It's like, I don't want to argue with spooks for the rest of my life. That is a complete waste of time. And I think it's great for people to learn there, but then get the heck out of there and go talk to real people. And so in the course of my JFK research, one day at the library, I pulled out the wrong drawer. I thought I was pulling out the FBI's files of microfilm. In the pre-internet days, that's how you research things, was through microfilm at the library.
Tangible media. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And there were like little reels of microfilm. You feed it through the reader and it shows you a page at a time, a frame at a time. And I had, honestly, the FBI files on the case were very interesting. They included a lot of old newspapers, including one from Dallas, where the headline was 6 shots fired in Dealey Plaza. Now, at the time, I didn't realize how significant that heading was, and I've never found that file again, but I saw it in the FBI file, so I know it was there. But anyway, so I pulled out the wrong drawer, and this drawer happened to have the SUS files, which I knew enough to know were the Special Unit Senator files from the Robert Kennedy assassination, the younger brother of the president, who was a senator, who was killed right in Los Angeles where I lived. So I knew enough to know that those files had only been released in 1988. I knew very little beyond the official story and kind of the official conspiracy angle, too, because there's an official story on both sides, neither of which are quite true. And so I put in the reel and I started going through it. And right away, the reel I picked out at random, kind of like my picking out Malcolm Perry's testimony at random in the Warren Commission, I picked out like reel 5 or whatever it was at random. And it talked about this other guy named Michael Wayne, who was apprehended and handcuffed at the hotel and taken to the police in handcuffs. And I'm like, who is this guy and why have I never heard about it? Why are we always told that Sirhan was the only suspect if another guy was apprehended at the hotel? And the more I looked into him, it's like, people thought he was running from the pantry with a gun. People started following him. It looked like he made a handoff in the lobby of the gun to somebody who then ran out a different door and jumped the hedge and disappeared into the night. And Michael Wayne got captured, and everything he was saying that night ended up being a lie. All the stuff he was saying. This is
Michael Wayne, right?
Yes, and that picture on the top right there, when I first showed that to Munir Sirhan, the brother of Sirhan, the accused assassin or convicted assassin, even though he shouldn't have been, you can see in the kind of the top middle, there Robert Kennedy is signing the poster, the rolled up poster. When he's captured, that poster is no longer in the roll. It's wide and it's open as if it could have concealed a gun. Yeah. And I don't know if they have the full picture. I'm looking to see the other pictures. Yeah, it doesn't look like they have the after picture of him in handcuffs. But it's online. If people search far enough, they'll find it. I tried to get permission from the guy who took that photo, Steve Fontini, who used to work for the LA Times, but sadly his mind was gone by then and he didn't know what I was talking about. And
oh, really?
So, because I really wanted to add the picture of Michael Wayne in handcuffs to my book, because I thought that would be, help people. Anyway, when I showed that picture to Munir, he kind of froze for a minute. He goes, oh my God, that guy looks so much like my brother. He's like, if I didn't know my brother as well as I did, I would think that was Sirhan. And that's actually what seemed to happen. A lot of people confused Michael Wayne for Sirhan. And when they saw a shooter or a guy with dark curly hair who was acting suspiciously, there was a fire photographer there to photograph any violations of the fire code, like too many people in a room or whatever. His name was Harold Burba. He testified to the grand jury that he saw Sirhan, but it was really Michael Wayne, walking through with this poster. And he's like, it was as if he was kind of, scouting out the room. There was something sinister about the way he was looking around. And he described him, and then later, after his grand jury testimony, the police went back to him And they showed him a little video clip of Michael Wayne. He goes, yeah, that's the guy. And they're like, but that's not Sirhan.
That's not the guy.
Yeah. And he's like, oh, so his whole testimony was wrong. Well, Harold Burba also was a witness to a shooter standing on the table firing down into the crowd. Sirhan was never at any point standing on the table. He was pushed onto the table, with 5 people on him after, he started firing, but he was not standing on the table firing down. And I can talk about what that means, but we probably should back up and set the scene for what was happening.
No, for sure. Yeah, I just, there's a couple things I want to break out because I feel like, obviously JFK's assassination gets the most coverage because of the grandiose scale that it was on. He was the president, whereas his brother's running for president. But what I don't, definitely people in my generation, they're completely unaware of why would why would somebody want RFK dead? And what I think a lot of people in my generation forget is that RFK was JFK's attorney general. They were stirring the pots. Okay. As JFK was president, RFK was right by his side. So
yes, they had the same philosophy. Yes.
Well, and in many ways, the same enemies because they were literally doing the things that were making the people mad at them. So I also think that, at least with RFK's assassination, in the same way that JFK, what he stood for, a disruption of the old guy, what's the word I'm looking for?
Old boy network.
Yeah. The threat that they posed to that was too great. The money train would stop for a lot of people who were making a lot of money in a lot of nefarious ways. So
off the suffering of others, yes.
Off the suffering of others. And these guys were, they weren't squeaky clean, but they were trying to create something better. That's why their era is referred to as Camelot.
Right.
They were trying to create something better. And that's the real threat that these guys posed. So from that perspective, I've never been able to look at who they said assassinated these people and be like, it makes total sense why that guy would want to stop that. It just doesn't, when you look at all the other factors around them and the true disruption that they were going to make, if they were able to get the things that they wanted into action, people have died over less. $1 billion? Like, what's a human life worth to people like that? It's not a problem to kill a president. It's not a problem to kill a senator if they're going to disrupt, a generation of cash flow. And another thing with, at least with JFK's, this is, for my bachelor party, I went to Dealey Plaza.
Oh my
that was
gosh.
my thing. So me and my friend went to Dallas and we went to Dealey Plaza. I had been when I was a really little kid, but I was too young and ignorant to recognize what I was doing. So I went there as an adult with my buddy and, obviously a somber situation. You stand there and you look at the scene, how small it is. You have this idea that it's like so much bigger. But in the museum, they have a portion of the museum that's committed to the conspiracy. And that to me is like, wait a minute, in the official museum, because it is such a known thing that there's so many loose ends here. They had to acknowledge it in the official museum.
What year did you go? I just have to ask.
2 years ago.
Okay, because I was going to say there didn't used to be an official conspiracy section, so that's interesting. Okay,
it's a huge wall at the very end, and it's of course all the official story as you're walking through the museum. But when he and I got there, he and I were both just kind of shocked. We were not expecting to see that.
Yeah.
And I feel like maybe that's a thing that has evolved over time where it's become such an unavoidable thing that it has to be talked about. But I don't know if RFK's assassination has gotten to that point. And I've watched a few documentaries. I've seen at least a number of different angles of what conspiracy could have been happening in that room that night. But I feel like this one always gets lost in the wake of the hoopla around JFK's assassination and cover up. So I guess
I think
you're completely
that's
right.
by design, because the RFK case falls apart so easily. I mean,
Yeah.
in 5 minutes, I can prove conspiracy. In the JFK case, after 50 years, people say, well, there's no proof of conspiracy. Well, actually, I think I could disprove that one in 5 minutes now, too. But there's so much noise and disinformation layered into the JFK story. It seems impenetrable from the outside, whereas the RFK case is much simpler. I want to go back and mention one thing about that museum, because I was in there too. First, they've walled off with glass the area where Oswald supposedly stood and made the shot.
Right.
They say they did that because the floor was sinking in that spot. I don't buy that for a minute. I think they did that because when you stand there, you'll know there was no shot to be had from that window. The founder, the guy who set up that museum in the first place, was a CIA officer. I am not making that up. People can Google that. It's out there.
What was his name?
I don't remember offhand, but whenever I forget, I can always go Google him and look that up. So, yeah, it's just shocking, the story of that. That's why I'm surprised, because for years there was no acknowledgement that a conspiracy was possible. Everything was designed to say, well, some people have suggested, but that couldn't happen because, and it was used to shut down conspiracy. So, you want me to find it real quick here?
Yeah, I have to. I would definitely want to get that on there. I'm also trying to see if I can find a picture.
I'll look it up after, because it'll take too much time. I might have to go through my newspapers. Yeah, newspapers. Newspapers.com is a really good resource, but you have to pay for it. Everybody should know that their own library, if they have a library card, they can search newspaper databases for free. All you need is your library card number. And all the libraries do this. So go check out. There's so much information at your fingertips that wasn't available when I first started. I had to physically go to the library and wait for newspaper articles to be delivered to me. Now you can just find almost anything. Anyway, so I want to go back also to an earlier point you said about the same people wanting to kill them because they had the same policies. And that's true, but there's an additional layer, and that's that Robert Kennedy had been a Senate investigator, and quite a good one. And he exposed a lot of illegal, blood trade of us funding, sending weapons to the Soviets at the same time we were fighting them in Vietnam, or whatever, or to the Chinese. He was a really good investigator. And for that reason, people feared him becoming president, because one of the things he made clear to close associates, even though he denied it in public, he always said he supported the Warren Commission. But in private to his friends, he's like, I know that's crap.
Yeah,
but the only way I'll ever be able to get to the bottom of it is if I'm president. And it's one of the reasons he wanted to run for president, is he really wanted to be able to find and prove who killed his brother. And of course, he was killed before he could do that. So I've often thought that people waste a lot of time on the JFK assassination. They kind of start from the wrong angle, because when you start from the Robert Kennedy case, it's much easier to figure out who killed JFK, because it's the same people who killed RFK. And I think it's a much more transparent plot. So let's talk about the plot. Let's talk about what happened.
Let's get into it.
Yeah. So Robert Kennedy was running for president as a Democratic, nominee. Early in the year, out in the New Hampshire primary, which again used to be first, was always first till the Democratic Party didn't want Robert Kennedy Jr. to win it and moved South Carolina first this last cycle, which was just incredible, throwing out all that history. But Eugene McCarthy won the New Hampshire primary, not Lyndon Johnson, who was the president and the successor, then in power. And that caused real shockwaves, because one of the reasons Robert Kennedy didn't want to run in 1968 is he was very afraid of splitting the party in half and letting Nixon take over, because he knew Nixon was a really bad guy and didn't want him to be president. So although people had been pressuring him to run, he had planned to wait till 1972 when LBJ, would be totally done. But after LBJ lost, due to the Vietnam War and everything was going on, and he had some health issues, and I think he especially didn't want to run against the brother of the guy who had slain, the brother of JFK. because RFK entered the race and LBJ dropped out a week later. So
Well, wasn't there history? Didn't they have like really tumultuous
a lot of animosity.
relations?
Yeah, in fact, JFK was considering dropping LBJ to run, the second term because a lot of LBJ's, corrupt business dealings were coming to the front. But he needed him to win the South. That's why he brought him in the first time.
Gotcha.
They weren't, partners. It was a political marriage. It wasn't like it was somebody he liked or trusted. And by the way, a lot of the civil rights stuff that LBJ is credited with passing was done because Jackie Kennedy used to put on her widow weeds and go to the office, and he could never say no to her.
Yeah.
Because everybody loved Jackie, and she wanted JFK's civil rights bill passed. And so LBJ gets the credit, but that all came from JFK. Strong push there. Anyway, so this is the context and the background. So now it's Hubert Humphrey, who was the vice president, who's like the official nominee of the party. Think of RFK as Bernie Sanders in a way. And, Hubert Humphrey is like the Hillary Clinton or something. It's like there was the establishment Democrat and then there was the upstart Democrat. And of course, Eugene McCarthy had been the Bernie Sanders like figure until Bobby entered the race. And
Gotcha.
Bobby was like the real thing, whereas Eugene McCarthy, Bobby thought Eugene McCarthy was fake, and he really didn't want him to win. His supporters, I'm sure, would argue that, but that was Bobby's opinion. And so he's like, if the party is split anyway, if somebody else is going to challenge him anyway, it might as well be me. So that's why he entered. And he said many times, he's like, I know there are guns between me and the White House, meaning he knew he was risking his life by doing this. But he also knew it needed to be done. People were being slaughtered en masse in Vietnam with our tax money, our weapons, our soldiers who were then coming back bankrupt and disreft and mentally disturbed from what they'd been forced to do. And he wanted to end all of that. And he wanted to restore the goodwill that other nations had under JFK. There's so many good things that JFK was doing that people didn't hear about because after he was killed, there was a deliberate effort to suppress. It was important not to kill just JFK, but everything that he stood for.
Right.
So that no one would ever try that again. And so that guy has been smeared in discredited ways I had no idea about until I started researching these cases. And they've done a little bit of the same to Bobby. People tried to say he was responsible for Marilyn Monroe's death or that he was there and personally killed her. That's just ridiculous. Yeah. We know where he was that night. There's so much crap about that. But anyway, so now we cut to California. He'd actually just lost the Oregon primary previously to Eugene McCarthy, even though he won a few before that. Martin Luther King had been killed in April of that year, just 2 months before the June primary, and Bobby had spoken in a sort of impromptu speech that he pretty much wrote on the plane on the way there to explain to them that Martin Luther King had been killed because most of the crowd didn't even know that yet, when they showed up to hear him. So it was a tumultuous, dangerous time. And the Oregon loss was kind of freeing to him because it meant he wasn't just running on the Kennedy name and it wasn't a shoo-in. He was going to have to fight for it and he was going to have to earn it on his own terms. And so in a way that helped him really come into himself in California. And he went up and down the state. He traveled 1,200 miles the day before, the primary vote was held. He was tired. Anyway. So now we're at June 4th, the day of the primary, and he ends up sleeping at the home of John Frankenheimer, who very ironically directed the movie The Manchurian Candidate, which suggested, you can't make this stuff up. Talk about that. One of the consultants to that movie was a hypnotist named William Bryan. And Bryan, immediately after RFK was shot, got on the radio suggesting that Sirhan had been under hypnosis and had been mind controlled. And Brian was known to brag a lot, so it's almost like he wanted people to see his work. There's really good evidence,
Wow.
and I don't want to take the time here to go into it, but I'd say read my chapter on mind control for why I think Brian is really the best candidate for the hypnotist because of things that show up in Sirhan's diary that Brian was connected with. So, anyway, so we don't know this yet. Of course, it's still morning of June 4th. We don't know he's going to be killed. He manages to save his son's life that day. David had been swept away by the serious undertow off of Malibu, and Bobby had jumped in and swam out and rescued him, and he got bumped a little bit, and that's why there's kind of a swelling on one part of his eyebrow when you watch his interviews. There's just a little bit of a bump there. That's what that's from. So he drives to the hotel. They don't have projections at that point. Some of the elections, they can call it like as soon as the polls close, they start, giving you their projections. And they had moved to an electronic voting system that year. 1968
Interesting.
was the first time we were cut. Yeah, in the
Wow.
Democratic primary in California, right next to the Ambassador Hotel, they were using punch cards to vote. And there were sheriffs guarding the punch cards to make sure no one came in and stole them or switched them out or whatever. And so the sheriffs were literally right next door, if you will. So anyway, Bobby Kennedy, it's now after midnight, and now we're on June 5th because he's been waiting. He wasn't sure, but now it's clear that he's won the California primary. So he and his team go down. By the way, Michael Wayne has been hanging out on his floor. Michael Wayne had been begging press passes everywhere he went because press passes were like all access passes at a concert. He could go anywhere with a press pass. And he told people he was collecting them, and people gave them to him, shockingly enough.
Gosh.
And then he ends up handing them off to somebody else right before the shooting occurs. So if he's collecting them, why did he suddenly give them away? Anyway, Michael Wayne, I've got like a huge section on him in my book because I really think he was running the on-the-ground plot. I don't know if he was one of the shooters, but I think he was making sure the shooters got in and out. And by having press passes, he could ensure he got them into the pantry. And then, like I said, he was caught literally what people thought he was running a gun out in a rolled up poster, which is pretty interesting. Anyway, so Bobby gives his acceptance speech at the Ambassador Hotel, and then at the back of the stage, there's a line. How do I want to say it? If you're facing the stage, there's a little row of people behind the stage going down to the left, because that room was where the public victory party was going to be held. And they wanted people to think he was going to go that way. It was like a fake, basically.
Yeah.
And ironically, somebody thought they saw some action under the stairs, like there might have been a shooter hiding under the stairs there on that side. I honestly think had he gone down there, Sirhan would be free, but some other poor jerk would be in jail.
Some other patsy, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't mean to call Sirhan a jerk. You know what I mean? Poor soul. Anyway, but Bobby Kennedy goes to the right, and this had been decided literally like 5 minutes into his speech which way they were going to send him. Because one of the things Bobby always did at every stop was talk to the print media. And the most direct and least crowded route to the print media was through this narrow kitchen. It's kind of a kitchen staging area. They called it the pantry. It had a big ice machine. It had some steam tables where the food was, put on the plates, plated, as they say, and, and taken out for room service or catering or whatever. Excuse me. I mentioned that coffee might happen.
Oh, no worries. I'm going to pull up a picture of the pantry too so people can see it.
Yeah. Oh, that one at the top right. Can you zoom in on that? Because that's a super important photo.
This one right here?
Actually, it has a bunch of good photos. Yeah. I'm trying to find that photo again. There it is. Okay, stop right where you are, top right. Can you zoom in on it?
No, I got you.
That
I
one.
got you. Hang on.
Yeah.
This one. Yeah.
That one. Yep. Yeah. Can you zoom in on that or make that bigger? Okay.
That's it looks about as big as I can make it.
Yeah. So where there's somebody standing kind of straight back in the center, that is the double doors that Kennedy walked through. And he walked through the one to the right, not the one to the left, which was closed but not locked. So, but the one on the right was open. All right. Where the cop is on the left, there's a space, a gap between that ice machine and the divider wall. And in the space between the ice machine and the divider wall, it appears a busboy was hiding there, and it's on video as Kennedy is walking in to give his speech, because he came through, from the front of the photo to the back of the photo. That's the path he took to get to the stage to give his acceptance speech. And then he was going to come back the same way he had gone out. But the video is following him. At one point, you see a guy in a white busboy uniform in that gap. That guy in the white busboy uniform, I believe, made the headshot. And that makes it me, different from all the other conspiracy theorists, but I have two really good witnesses to that, which again, I talk about in my book. But I want to point out now, these steam tables and the door are much further apart than it looks. There's like maybe 10, 12 feet between the end of the steam tables and that door in the back. Yeah. And Kennedy had come like half of that distance. And Sirhan was at the front area, even with the front of the first steam table toward the back. Yeah. And so Kennedy enters, he's immediately greeted by, there's literally 77 people in this small space crowded together wanting to meet him, including a lot of the kitchen staff and people who worked there. And Bobby was so sweet to them, and he stopped and he talked to everybody, busboys. It was one of the reasons Bobby was so beloved, is he didn't discriminate. He wasn't one of those, I only talk to the rich donors, he wanted to talk to
not
everybody.
The peasants. Yeah, he
exactly.
Wasn't like that.
He had been raised by his father and his mother to say, look, no one is better than anyone else. Very Catholic, we're all equals in the eyes of God, and you should treat everybody with the same respect and not give more respect just because somebody has more money and less respect because somebody has less. So really good guy. Anyway, so as he's coming that way, he turns and he's facing the right side of this picture and shaking the hand of a busboy standing halfway between the door and the steam table. Sirhan, now on the left of the film, do you see where those round trays are and the tray stacker there?
Right here?
Yeah, right there. Okay, so Sirhan had been standing on that, and there was a girl in a polka dot dress standing behind him, holding him on the tray. Now, the advantage of that is, one, the girl keeps him in place, and two, she can see over the crowd because now she's a foot higher, and she can see when somebody is coming in. So we learn later, Sirhan was hypnotized by his original defense team to try and get him to remember what happened, because Sirhan had a total blackout for the events of the pantry. He remembers going in, pouring coffee for a girl in a polka dot dress, and then he doesn't remember anything else until he remembers being choked. And then he really doesn't remember anything else until he's came out of it in prison. Yeah. And so his memory of what happened is completely gone. And people have genuinely tried to recover it. And the person who got the closest was a hypnotist named Dan Brown, who spent hours with him, 60 hours with him, over a period of a couple of years, thanks to William Pepper, his then lawyer at the time. Dan Brown did not give him coercive hypnosis like his first defense team is. His first defense team is, they put him under hypnosis and they're like, Sirhan, reach for your gun. Kennedy is coming. Reach for your gun. Okay, do you remember that? It's like, it's just crazy. That is not how hypnosis is supposed to be done. Dan Brown did it the right way. What do you see? What do you hear? What happened next? Who's near you? Are you talking to anyone? Exactly. Very open-ended. And in that scenario, he found that the girl who was holding him on the tray stacker, Sirhan was very sexually attracted to her. He thought he was going to get lucky that night. He had followed her into the room, and she had kind of positioned him there. And then he said at one point, she looked up to her right. What do you see when you look up to the right? you would see somebody standing on the table where I believe another shooter was.
Right, over
and
here.
not only a shooter, but a spotter. Maybe Michael Wayne was up on the table. Somebody was on that table who was really above the crowd. Cause, the girl, even a foot higher, is still not as tall as like Paul Schrade, who's 6'2", 6'3". He was a very tall guy. Somebody had to be able to see over the 6'2" and 6'3" people in the room. Somebody on the table could do that. So the girl looks up to her right, she sees something, and then she moves Sirhan directly to the middle of this room, and then she pinches Sirhan in a way. And then he's like, and then suddenly I was back at the shooting range. He had spent the early part of the day at the shooting range. Shooting was a hobby, target shooting. He would take a gun out and go and shoot at targets. It's something he had learned in ROTC when he went to college. And, it was just a fun thing for him. And, so he was in the grip of a hypnotic illusion, and I would not have believed that. If somebody had told me that and I hadn't looked into this case, I would go, that sounds crazy. Oh, how convenient. What a great lie. But the thing is, I met a woman in the grip of a hypnotic illusion one time, and I will never forget it because it really kind of freaked me out. When I was writing my chapter on mind control, I tried to go to as many hypnosis shows as I could, and a lot of them are at county fairs. So I went to a number of the county fairs over a couple years and, shows in Vegas, things like that. And this one show I got really lucky because I ended up sitting next to somebody before the show who was then in the show, and then I saw her after the show. So I had the before, during, and after experience. Before the show, completely nice, normal, sane, just like girl next door type, very nice, very calm, composed, everything you'd expect a normal person having fun at a show to be. And then she gets, the guy asks for volunteers and she volunteers, and she goes up on stage, and the hypnotist tells her that she won a $35,000 check. And she jumps around all excited. He hands her like Monopoly money and tells her it's a $35 check.
Of course, yeah.
And she really believes it. And she's jumping around and stuff. And some people say, oh, that's just an act. No one's really hypnotized. It's like, well, let me get to the rest of the story here. Because after the show, the first thing I did was I wanted to talk to the hypnotist, because every hypnotist always says in their show, you can't make people do something against their will. And you can't, but you can alter their reality. Like if you try and hypnotize a girl and tell her to take off her clothes, she won't. But if you hypnotize the girl and then you say you're on this tropical island and the sun is, beaming on you and it feels so good, except now it's
very,
getting
very
hotter
hot.
and hotter and hotter.
Yeah.
Eventually the girl will take her clothes off because she's in that reality. So, and that's not something that would be against her moral code to do because that fits the situation. So, anyway, so this woman, after I talked to the hypnotist, I talked about Sirhan briefly. He looked very nervous and he quickly left the area. Now, he's way too young to have been involved, but it must be something they talk about amongst themselves. It's obvious to them that Sirhan was hypnotized. I've learned that from other hypnotists. But anyway, so as the crowd is partying, because, the show's over, everybody's clearing, this woman is still there, and she looks really distraught. And like I said, I'd sat next to her at the beginning of the show, and she wasn't distraught at all. So I'm like, did you lose your family? What's going on? Are you okay? And she goes, well, I have to give this back. And she's looking around. I'm like, what do you mean? And she's like, well, it's a $35,000 check. I have to give it back. And I'm like, oh my God, she's still hypnotized. And I tried to bring her out of it. I said, can we look at that together? And she's like, yes. And I'm like, can I touch it with you? And she said, yes. I'm like, can we bring it closer? And she's like, yes. I'm like, do you see in the top right that it says 100? And she says, it's a $35,000 check and I have to return it. And I was so freaked out by that because it's like she was in the grip of a hypnotic illusion and I could not bring her out of it. And I felt so sorry for her. And then I wondered, it's like, God, I hope she didn't go home, find the hypnotist, write him a $35,000 check.
Yeah, right,
send
exactly.
it off.
You need to
it's
return this to you. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. It was horrifying to me that she was still hypnotized and didn't even know it. And she looked as normal as she had before the show. It wasn't like her eyes were glazed or she was, looking weird or anything. We've often seen in movies where people are like, eyes half open. That's not how hypnosis works.
Yeah.
It is how some, if the hypnotist tells you you're sleepy and you can barely open your eyes, then people will do that. But most of the time they look completely normal. So when I read then later after that incident, that Sirhan, claimed he saw targets at the shooting range when he was standing in the pantry, I believe him because I saw that happen to somebody else. And it also made sense because I'm like, even under hypnosis, I found it really hard to believe Sirhan would actually fire at Robert Kennedy. He actually liked Robert Kennedy. He said when he saw him, he thought he was a saint, because he was in favor of the little guy. And, the official story is that Sirhan hated him because Bobby was sending planes to Israel. Well, first of all, the date that supposedly happened, doesn't make sense with the timeline and how could Sirhan have heard about it? There was no radio broadcast. There was no television broadcast of that. So even that story falls apart. But it makes much more sense to me that he literally pulled out a gun and started firing at targets, straight ahead. After 2 such shots, he was immediately shoved onto that steam table. Since he was firing with his right hand, they bent him backward over the table. And the first thing they did was move his gun hand away from the crowd towards that back right corner. They tried to make sure that, if he was still firing, they didn't want him to hit any people. And yet, not only was Kennedy shot 4 times, only 3 of which entered his body, but 4 times because one went through his coat, 5 other people were shot. All right. And they had bullets removed from them. So Kennedy had 2 bullets removed from him. A 3rd bullet had gone through his chest. He was shot once behind the ear at a distance of about 1 inch and twice under the arm, right up at the top. If you put your 2 fingers there, and I know that for sure now because I've seen the autopsy photos, which are quite gruesome, and I don't want you to pull them up or anybody else. They're really
sure.
gruesome.
We'll get
your own research
blacklisted
only.
immediately. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, do not. Do not. But it also, I'm glad they're out there because now it makes 100% clear exactly where the shots entered, and they were right under the arm. Well, that arm, how do I want to say it? Kennedy had just started to walk forward again after shaking. I told you he faced the wall to the right to shake a busboy's hand. Sirhan steps out and starts firing just as Kennedy is turning to walk forward towards us. This
way, yeah.
Toward the front of the picture, I guess, toward the bottom of the picture, which I call the front, and the doors in the back are the back of the picture. So Kennedy is walking towards us, the viewer of that picture. And Sirhan, if he had bullets, his first shot was a clear one. There was no one between him and Robert Kennedy. And the first shot, if it were a bullet, would have hit Kennedy square in the chest. But it didn't because Sirhan was firing blanks. And I know this for 2 reasons. One, not one of the bullets in the pantry ever could be matched definitively to Sirhan's gun. They said it looks similar, but we really can't prove it. The markings weren't exactly the same. So that's problem number 1. And then problem number 2 is that everybody who heard it said it sounded like a cap gun. I mean, there's a number of witnesses, and I didn't even put them all in my book. There are more. I picked out some of the best ones and put it in my book, but there were several other people who said the same thing. Of course it sounded like a cap gun. He was literally firing blanks. Yeah, exactly. Caps, yeah. He was firing caps. So of course it sounded like a cap gun. Rayford Johnson, who was an Olympic decathlon champion, even said it looked like a cap gun throwing off residue, meaning when you fire a cap, it is just a wad of paper that flash burns and creates kind of a little, paper particle cloud, so to speak. So Rayford, he'd seen these all his life. He knew, he was like an expert at what a cap gun throwing off residue would look like. So I take that very seriously. If it had been some Joe off the street who'd maybe played with a cap gun once, I wouldn't necessarily believe that. But coming from Rayford, that's highly credible. That's like expert witness testimony.
Yeah, for sure.
And the guy who first captured, the maitre d' who first caught Sirhan, he swears it was after the second shot and then moves the gun away. So how can Kennedy be shot 4 times if the gun is moved away after the second shot. And, of course, here's the really big problem. Sirhan's gun muzzle was placed 3 feet in front of Kennedy by the only witnesses who saw them both clearly and identified both clearly. Some people saw Bobby and they saw a gun to his head, but they couldn't see who the shooter was. Other people saw Sirhan firing a gun, but they didn't see Bobby. So the only people who are credible about the distance between them are obviously those who saw them both. And there was one more witness who said, they were right next to each other, but this was a guy looking through a camera in a somewhat darkened pantry. It wasn't brightly lit or anything. And, so his judgment could be way off. The camera foreshortens everything. It's not an actual
The perspective is
representation.
skewed. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. So anyway, Sirhan is in front of, firing from in front, while Kennedy is shot 4 times from behind at a distance not more than 3 inches for any of the shots. And honestly, even the underarm shots, the Dwayne Wolfer, the LAPD criminalist at the trial, said 3/4 of an inch. Thomas Noguchi said this was 1 inch to 1.5 inches, the headshot. The headshot's what killed him, by the way. The underarm shots didn't, even though one punctured his chest and one lodged at the base of his neck. And then, like I said, the other shot went right through his, coat from behind, upward trajectory. Kennedy then spins around to his left and falls where that cop is. It's like he fell back into the left, so to speak, which is a sad echo of what happened prior.
I was just going to say, right, yeah.
Yes. And as Bobby's lying there, he's like, is everyone okay? Is Paul okay? He had seen Paul Schrade probably be hit and fall. And Bobby Kennedy Jr., unfortunately, gets this wrong because he says Sirhan's first shot hit Paul. Why? Why would that happen? It's like Sirhan was firing straight ahead. His arm was parallel to the ground, according to the witnesses. Paul is a tall guy. Sirhan would have had to be firing up away from Kennedy on his first shot, his only really unobstructed shot. It literally makes no sense. And Paul has always said, I fell first and Bobby fell second. That's not necessarily true. Some witnesses say that, but some witnesses say it happened the other way. Paul fell first. RFK fell first and then Paul. So, to me, it's likely they were both hit almost at the same time. And in my book, I describe Sirhan appears to have made 2 shots. Again, then he's tackled. And then there's like a volley of shots where people said it sounded like popcorn or firecrackers. And if you are planning an assassination and you don't want any one shooter to draw attention, how about 5 shooters, all firing from slightly different positions, and they all fire 1 shot each. And if they hit somebody else, so be it. And then what happened is those shooters evidently got out of the room so fast because people aren't even aware yet that shooting is happening. It takes a minute. People, are like, I thought it was, everybody was trying to think of it as something else until they basically saw Bobby fall down. And then they realized he had been shot. And by that moment, even though it's like, 30 seconds of processing in the brain, the shooters had already left the room. And it's just stunning how well this came off, but it does look like it was highly prepared. I quoted the Watergate burglars, E. Howard Hunt and Eugenio Martinez had written an article at one point, and they talked about how they rehearsed. This is just a break-in. This isn't even an assassination. They rehearsed it several times before they actually did it. This is how people don't understand this because people aren't in that world. But the CIA doesn't just do these random.
This is how operations are conducted. Yeah,
exactly. You practice, you rehearse. It's like a stage show, and especially with a hypnotized assassin. Now, here's the other reason I know Sirhan wasn't firing bullets, because if he's firing straight ahead, and again, Bobby doesn't have a wound in his chest, no one else is hit at that level either. It's like, where did that bullet go? And now, can you go back to that montage of photos?
Yeah, well,
Because there are bullet holes in the door frames. Because, like I said, the LAPD.
That's what I was going to ask.
Yeah.
I knew there were the strays that had been lodged in.
Yeah, and even those were
here.
tested and didn't match Sirhan's gun. I thought that's an important point because people could say, well, maybe his shots went there. Okay, go back to the one you were on first. So the long shot. Yeah. Okay. Is there a way to zoom in on this at all?
This is about as far as I can get.
Yeah. Can you see that the center divider, it's like the paneling has been pulled off of that? Because on the right
here?
Yeah, in the no, sorry, the one straight back. Yeah, that whole that should have been all white, but it's like brown white now. That's because they pulled off the veneer. I don't know what you call that part of the door paneling, but they pulled that off. Why would they do that? Well, now go back to the pictures and we'll look at the close-up shot of that. Okay, scroll down. Yeah, right in the center of that bottom row. That is a close-up before they pulled that panel off.
Ah, gotcha.
Now, in Dan Moldea's book, which starts out great, and I do encourage people to read it because he actually has some very important data in there. It's just, at some point he goes, but if it was a conspiracy, that means Wolfer lied, and I can't believe he lied, therefore it couldn't have been a conspiracy.
Oh, cool.
It's like the most
that makes
ridiculous
sense,
conclusion ever. Yeah. Especially when we know that Wolfer lied so much, it became a joke at the LAPD that they called people who lied there, if they fudged something about the evidence, they would call it a Wolferism because he was so famous for doing that. All right. But now we go back to, remember how I said the sheriffs were next door? Well, that
guarding the
circled
ballots.
photo. Yes. The first people in the pantry were not LAPD. They were the sheriffs. And they were the sheriffs who had been next door. Because when Paul Shiraga, announced that somebody called in basically to the police, there was a shooting, the sheriffs came running over, and that initial belongs to one of the sheriffs. And he said, that's what we do. When we pull a bullet out of the wall, we circle it and we initial it. That's our standard procedure. So to me, it's clear that guy took a bullet out of the wall. And because two of them are circled, I think he took 2 bullets, from that center door frame. All right, now zoom back out. There's another photo. So that's the center door frame. But now go look at the bottom left photo first for context. All right. And can you zoom in on that or make that bigger? A little bit.
I can't make this one any. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, there you go.
About it.
There you go. But you see 2 bullets there. All right. Now, this piece of paneling is still on the door frame. But what happened is I have a video where it's like a 3/4 inch piece of wood that's on top of the actual post. Mm-hmm. And there's a video that shows that paneling pulled off and put to the side, and a hand points to these 2 holes in the wall behind it. And that's, again, it's important because although they're circled and labeled just like the other ones were, the police tried to explain that away by saying, oh, somebody was just sticking pencils in the wall. Well, a pencil doesn't go through 3/4 inch of wood. So there were holes behind these holes proving it was a bullet that had penetrated. And in the video, the hand also points above those 2. You can't see in this photo because we can't zoom in enough, but the hand points as if there's a 3rd bullet still in the wood there.
Interesting.
And notice the paneling to the left and how a piece at the bottom right has been cut out and that door paneling has slid down. The FBI caption to that photo says purportedly a bullet was removed from that part. All right. Now, let's forget about that one. Let's just say we misunderstood that. But you can see there's 2 holes in the far left of the door frame from our standpoint facing it, and 2 holes in the center door frame. Those had to have bullets in them because bullets don't go into the wood that far and then back themselves out and turn around and hit people, right? That's a physical impossibility.
Yeah.
And yet the police just pretended those bullet holes didn't exist at all. And because if you do, the count of the bullets is now up to 12. Even with the LAPD's ridiculous scenario where they have bullets literally bouncing into one of the bullets, they had 3 bullet holes in the ceiling and then 7 bullets removed from people. right? So to explain that and keep that to 8 bullets, they say, well, 1 bullet went up into the ceiling, hit something, bounced back down, and ended up in one of the shooting victims. The other bullet, got lost in the ceiling space. That's how they explain away those 3 holes to keep it to 8. But right here, we have evidence of 4 more. So there's 12 bullets. Sirhan's gun could only hold 8. So even if he were firing bullets, he couldn't have fired all the bullets. Somebody else was firing, clearly. Now, if Sirhan's firing blanks, this is where other researchers get, upset, because they're like, but if Sirhan's firing blanks, that means there were 2 other shooters. And that's just crazy. I'm like, you think they'd only have 1 actual assassin in the room?
Yeah,
they would have
exactly.
multiple assassinations.
From different angles, all shooting at a triangulated point. Yeah.
Exactly. And if the guy is directly beside and behind Kennedy, which he had to be shooting him in those spots, why would you let Sirhan fire actual bullets? Because what if he hits the assassin before the assassin takes out RFK? It actually makes the most sense that he'd be firing blanks. It fits all the evidence, and it makes sense. So I believe that he was firing blanks. And that, again, so the problem then is, who's the other shooter? There's at least 1 shooter next to Kennedy. Remember the girl looking up at the guy standing on the table?
Polka dot dress.
Yeah, I remember I talked about Harold Burba, who thought Michael Wayne was Sirhan and saw him casing the joint, basically. Well, Harold Burba also says quite clearly the shooter was standing on the table. There's also video of George Green saying the shooter was standing on the table. There's even a news article in 1975 that says the shooter was standing on the table. There was a shooter on the table, and I believe the purpose of that shooter was to make it look like Sirhan was firing, because somebody had to be firing from Sirhan's direction to make any of this look remotely plausible.
Right.
If the bullets only went behind Sirhan, they couldn't pin it on him, right? So the bullets had to be in front of Sirhan and in his line of fire somewhere for that to make sense. Also, that person was not hypnotized and would know not to fire at the other assassin. He would know where to fire, where it was safe to fire, and where it wasn't. Whereas Sirhan, in his hypnotic state, could have been firing anywhere. You wouldn't trust an assassination plot to a guy under hypnosis. And I read in the book, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, which is what I want to call a limited hangout of the CIA's assassination mind control experiments. It talks about some of them and how some of them were successful. One hypnotist got one of his secretaries to pick up a gun and shoot at another secretary while she slept. The gun wasn't loaded, and people have said, well, that's why she fired it, because she knew the gun wouldn't be loaded. But that's a ridiculous argument, because it's like, okay, then just give her a loaded gun and she's going to assume it's not loaded and she's going to fire it, and then a bullet's going to come out, right? So that literally makes no sense.
Well, and I think too, I've read a ton into hypnosis. I read a bunch of books, in fact, from the 50s of known the real big names in hypnotism who were talking about medical applications. What I think a lot of people confuse hypnotism as it is now as like this kooky thing that, again, everyone's putting on a show. And yes, it is a thing. Even in those books, it says you can't hypnotize someone to do something they don't want to do. But also in those books, they talk about like this, at least a few that I read. I can't remember the guy's name. They're buried in a box somewhere right now, but they were great because it was basically this guy just saying, I've trained doctors to use this so that people don't have to go under anesthesia. People who don't like needles, the doctor can put them in a hypnotic state and do whatever dental work or, do whatever procedure they need to do. In the 50s and 60s, this stuff was serious science. Like, people were seriously applying it in serious ways, not just for stage shows at fairs, or I saw a bunch at my high school, like a hypnotist would come in and hypnotize some of my classmates. Yeah. This stuff was very, very serious. And then,
the police used it frequently to interrogate criminals too. They would put them under hypnosis to try and get them to remember what was going on. They would bring witnesses in and hypnotize them to try and remember details. Yes. It's funny because somebody on one of the podcasts, suggested she likened, hypnosis to astrology, I'm like, wait, no, this is a real hard science.
Yeah,
This is
not it's
this is
the
not
abstract.
hypothetical.
Yeah,
And
the abstract,
Yeah, the CIA in their own files admitted some
They were
operational
serious.
successes with it.
Yeah, they
Yes.
were real serious about
Yes.
it. Yeah.
And George Estabrooks, who was they often called the father of modern hypnosis, he wrote a book called Hypnotism where he describes a scenario that sounded to me so much like Lee Harvey Oswald. He said,
Yeah.
we took a Marine and we programmed we split his personality in two. They can do that under hypnosis. And personality A, we programmed to be a very diehard communist. But personality B was the solid, loyal American. And B had access to all of A's memories, but A did not have access to B's memories. And so I think that's what was done, that Sirhan was sent to the Soviet Union under persona A, and then reported back to the CIA under persona B. I mean, it really does sound so much like what happened. So yeah, like I said, the use was operational. They had successes. And there's a reason that Richard Helms, when he was fired by Nixon in the Watergate fallout in 1973 and made ambassador to Iran, the one thing he did on the way out is he ordered the burning of all the MK Ultra files, all the mind control files. And I also want to say MK Ultra was one of many programs. It had tons of sub-projects under it, but there was also MK Naomi, MK Delta, MK Burn,
MK Search, MK
and
Often.
QK Hilltop, and Bluebird and Artichoke. Some of the experiments were done in connection with the other armed services. The Navy had its own mind control program, and the Navy CIA joint operation was called Bluebird. But Artichoke, in the Artichoke files, there's something very much that describes the scenario we just discussed. And it's like, it asks the question, can somebody of redacted nationality under hypnosis be convinced to perform an act of attempted assassination as part of a larger plot? In other words, can we put a patsy in there and make him draw focus while the real shooters get the job done? And I believe
Right.
that is exactly. The CIA worked with a famous magician, John Mulholland, who taught them, a lot about deception and misdirection. And Sirhan was the perfect distractor in a magic act. There he is, firing a gun, pulling focus. Once he starts firing blanks, everybody looks at his gun because they don't want to be shot. They don't know he's firing blanks. They just see a gun going off and they either freeze in fear or they drop to the ground or they try and escape. Those were like
Cover their face.
the three
Yeah,
reactions.
Exactly.
Yeah. One woman didn't do that because she had been at an event just a few days earlier in San Francisco where firecrackers had gone off at a Bobby Kennedy event. And everybody at that moment thought he was being shot. Now, he wasn't shot. Whether that was cover for a shot that didn't come off, I don't know, but he wasn't shot. But Freddie Plimpton, who was the wife of George Plimpton, she said to herself, she's like, if that had been a real assassination attempt, where should I be looking? And she mentally rehearsed this because she felt like everybody that his life was in danger. So she's like, I have to look at his head. I should look at his head. And so in the pantry during the shooting, she's like the only witness who's like, I saw a guy and he had been dressed like all the other busboys, guy in white busboy uniform, walk right up to Kennedy's head and shoot him. And there's another witness who said there was a guard that was holding Kennedy in place while he was being shot. And there were multiple ace security guards. There was one immediately literally holding Kennedy right at the moment when the shooting started. That guard's name was Thane Eugene Caesar. And he was not only a plumber by trade, he worked at the Lockheed Skunk Works CIA facility. He must have had some level of clearance for that. And he moonlighted as a bodyguard for Howard Hughes in Las Vegas. He had a relationship with Robert Mayhew that went back to when he was young because Mayhew and him had worked together at Bel Air Security, where Hughes used to live before he ended up in Las Vegas. So Mayhew appears to have used Thane Caesar as one of his guys in the pantry. Mayhew may have had other guys in the pantry. And it's not clear to me at all if Thane was the actual shooter of the underarm shots or if he was holding him in place while somebody else did that.
Yeah.
And I also think it could be two shots. To me, it does seem somewhat credible for Caesar to have been holding Kennedy by the elbow and then firing at him under the arm where no one could see it while the white busboy shoots him in the head. This all happened so fast. Or the white busboy shoots him in the head and then Thane Caesar shoots him as he's pulling him down because supposedly they saw him fall into Caesar's arms, because he was right there. So it's not clear. And like I said, it's not clear if Caesar killed Kennedy or he enabled it. It is clear, however, that it was Caesar's job to keep people who shouldn't be there out of the pantry. Yeah. So at some level, he's guilty no matter what. He's totally guilty.
Well, and the connections, like I had heard the idea that maybe he was in some way involved, but those other connections you just listed are.
Oh, it gets better. It gets better. He's a CIA contract agent. And I first saw this on LinkedIn and I laughed because I'm like, who is spoofing this? This can't be true. But then I thought, well, what if it is true? What if he's just so cocky now in his old age that he doesn't mind listing that? And so I actually went and you can order like background checks on people. There are many different suppliers of that online.
Sure.
And I ordered from 3 different companies and they all came back with the same results. They listed his literally his only line of work was always CIA contract employee, even though his employers included places like the Mormon Church and Detroit, GM in Detroit, even though he lived in Los Angeles.
He's
working in GM for Detroit
yeah.
Before the internet was a really big thing. He had a P.O. box in Washington, D.C., even though he was a plumber in Los Angeles. I mean, it makes sense that he was one of the addresses he gave for his workplace. I had to look it up on Google because it didn't really match anything that I knew about. And it was literally at the back gate to Langley. It's like, who would have that address to list? I didn't know there was a back gate to Langley. I had to do like an aerial view to see what I was looking at. I'm like, oh my God, he's giving the address on the back of CIA headquarters. So it's like the guy was a CIA contract agent. So you have a CIA contract agent literally holding Kennedy while either he shoots him or he holds him down while somebody else shoots him, or like I said, shoots him on the way down, whatever, deeply involved, who happens to work for the guy that the CIA hired to run the Castro assassination plots, Robert Mayhew. I always wondered, why did they pick Mayhew unless he had deep experience running assassination plots?
Yeah, right.
You don't hand the assassination of a foreign leader to some newbie, to some businessman. You hand it to a guy with a lot of experience getting people killed. So it makes sense that Mayhew would be involved in the Robert Kennedy assassination. And it's interesting because Mayhew and Bill Harvey, who a lot of people think arranged the physical assassins in Dealey Plaza for the JFK assassination, they had both gone to FBI together and were in the same class at Quantico. They didn't know each other well, but they knew each other. And Bill Harvey ran into Mayhew after Bobby had announced, but before the assassination, I want to say March or April. And Harvey talks to CIA. He's like, is Mayhew working for you guys? Because it wasn't known then, widely that he was a CIA asset. And, he doesn't get an answer. And he goes, Bobby Kennedy's running for president, right? It's like Harvey's like, are you going to kill this guy? Is Mayhew in on it? I don't know what Mayhew said to Harvey that made him bring that up. But I find that fascinating and sad. And so anyway, all of this is in my book and more because my book came out in 2018. But last year, my publisher said, look, we're going to do it in paperback form, but we'd like you to write some new material for it. So I literally wrote kind of a whole new chapter called an addendum. And they've also greatly expanded the index because that was one of the things that was hard to get them to do in the first place. To index any book means you have to hire somebody and pay them. And this is a small publisher. They don't have a lot of funding.
Sure.
So the first index was like names only. They literally, anybody who had a name, they indexed it. But the new index in the paperback is a full subject index, like the best books that you've seen. And so I'm super excited because people, if you get Kindle, you can search, and find any word or phrase. So that's a good way to do it. But if you want to be a book person, now you're going to have a really good index to the book. So, yeah. And the
link to this book
is,
will be in the description.
Right. The hardcover is no longer being printed. The paperback isn't out until July, but that's just, a few weeks away. And I believe you can pre-order it now. Yeah. So I highly recommend, it's not even just about the RFK assassination. I weave in a lot of history about the JFK case. I name the admiral who was really working for the CIA, who was in JFK's autopsy room in the book, which I think is a super important point. People always say, the military had to have done it because of the autopsy. I'm like, this guy was like a total CIA guy in the Navy running the autopsy. Come on. And I talk about the Martin Luther King assassination because there's some definite interesting overlaps there. Yeah, exactly. And in the addendum, I also go into other plots that have happened where somebody was firing blanks to distract from the shooters. This is evidently a thing. I didn't realize that when I first wrote my book. This is not unique to this case. So you can read more about that in the next version.
Well, there's so much overlap, especially with this era. It's like, in my opinion, even as a kid, I could recognize this as a power grab. Like
yes.
the powers that be saw that the times were changing, and all of these things are connected because it's a lot of the same people that are like, no, we don't want it to change. Anyone that's trying to change this, they need to disappear because it's going to disrupt the money train for us.
Exactly.
And, you start saying a lot of these names. That was one of the questions I was going to ask is like, how much overlap in specific people is there between his brother and his own assassination? But you're already dropping a bunch of names that are like, oh, well, that's a direct connection right there.
Yeah, well, I definitely want to mention after my book came out and after I finished the addendum, unfortunately, because I definitely don't have time to go rewrite it now, a file was released that indicated the CIA not only had a security file it had a security file on Oswald that was held by James Angleton. That was in James Angleton's counterintelligence group, which is operational, not informational. All right. James Angleton's group also had the file on Sirhan. Now, of course, this is supposedly a post-assassination file, but so was Oswald's at first. And then we learned that they had a 5-year history of Oswald in their files.
Yeah.
So I am super eager to see what the declassification board is going to release about the RFK case, because I know there's at least one security file. I've heard a rumor there's a second security file, which would also be interesting, because if one belonged to the Office of Security, that's where the mind control operations were. Oswald had 2 files, one in the operational and one in counterintelligence, which was, again, on the operational side, but slightly separate group within there. The Office of Security and Counterintelligence both work together to prevent the CIA from being penetrated. The Office of Security is also responsible for covering up after any exposed CIA operations. So those two groups work closely. But from the file that I saw, it makes it sound like the CIA injected themselves into the LAPD's investigation. It doesn't sound like the LAPD went to CIA and asked for their help. It sounds like CIA reached out and said, hey, tap, tap, tap. We can help you with background information on Sirhan or other suspects. Let's work together. And
How
that's
convenient.
really damn interesting. Yeah.
Well, that was going to be another thing I was going to say, is that there's been a few things I've seen about press, both like from legitimate institutions and independent, like photographers and stuff that were there just taking photos. There's a few that I know that have come forward and like, yeah, I was taking pictures. Even one guy who was in the room, who was taking pictures at the moment of the shooting. And before he was allowed to leave the site, they took all his film. And then he tried to get that film at some point in the future. And the authorities are like, oh, we never got that.
Yeah.
Just disappeared into the fog of war, So like whatever was occurring to cover this up, that's to me like what makes it clear that it was a plan, because there's if this was a truly spontaneous thing, when you are involved in spontaneous things like that, there's so much that can't be controlled because it's pure chaos. right? But I hear the stories of that thing, and they don't talk to the woman in the polka dot dress.
Well, they can't find her.
Yeah,
They
that completely
did try.
at all. Independent journalists and mainstream journalists had their film removed from their cameras, and then when they
even
asked for it in the
ABC,
future, it
CBS,
disappears.
NBC, the CIA basically got all that footage. Yeah. They burned. They literally burned photos in a hospital incinerator. They wanted those photos so burned that no one could ever reconstruct them again. They didn't just want to rip them into pieces and throw them in the back. And here's the thing. They kept about 100 or so, maybe 200 photos that have no value whatsoever. They, they basically show rooms and people grieving, but they don't show anything related that would be important at all. So why did they keep those photos and literally burn these others? Now, here's the other thing I've noticed. In the files that are left, there are no people in polka dot dresses. There are no polka dot scarves or skirts. I really have come to believe that the polka dot was the team colors, so that anybody who saw somebody else with polka dots would know it's safe to go there or talk to them. They're in on it. There was a guy in a polka dot tie where Sirhan poured the girl a cup of coffee. And it was that man who directed them toward the pantry, where the first person at the door was a girl in a polka dot scarf. It's like, and I think the polka dot,
of sorts.
Right. And under hypnosis, and the film Manchurian Candidate does this really well, you don't give somebody just one hypnotic command. You give them two. You give them like something that unlocks them for the next command, because if you unlock them too soon, then anything anybody says might get in there and they might act on it. So there's a great scene where the initial trigger is seeing the Queen of Diamonds, and then what follows will be the command to the person. And the first key is like, why don't you pass the time by playing solitaire or something like that? And the guy happens to be in the bar, and somebody says that to him innocently, why don't you pass the time? And as soon as he gets to the Queen of Diamonds, somebody in the bar says, why don't you go jump in a lake? And he's triggered because that was his cue, even though those weren't his handlers. So I think the polka dots were why don't you play a deck of cards, to keep him in that kind of ready state. And once he was in that state, of course, somebody had to be with him at all times, which is why he was seen with a girl in a polka dot dress or a guy in a gold sweater or both many times earlier in the night. There were like a dozen young girls who were there. And I talked to one of them, and I'm like, why did you notice them? What made them stand out? And she goes, well, you know how at political events today, everybody's in jeans and T-shirts and stuff. She goes, it wasn't like that then. She goes, that was a formal event. People were like dressed to the nines, but they were in more casual clothes. And so they really stood out. And we were making fun of them as young girls do, thinking, oh, why didn't they dress up? Look how awful they look. And so they were just kind of having their fun with them in that immature little girl way, not realizing, of course, that they were being witnesses to a team that was about to assassinate a
they did stand
candidate.
out, but for a different reason entirely. Yeah,
exactly.
So this is also something I want to make sure I touch on too. I can't remember the name of the documentary. I probably saw this documentary at least 15 years ago, but it was somebody going through the existing photos of the auditorium before he even comes out to give his speech. And they're focusing in, like in the JFK case, there's all these ideas like, oh, there's a picture, maybe it's George W. Bush, and there's a picture, maybe it's Edward Lansdale, but there's hard you know what I mean?
Where they thought it was Joe Annitas
in the plaza, right? Yeah. Like all of the stuff that has been said about that, and not to say that
I gotta say,
has convinced me or not, but just people have said it.
Yeah.
Is there any similar? Go ahead. No, go ahead.
There is and there isn't. There was Shane O'Sullivan had put out a BBC piece where they, honed in on a couple of people that he thought was George Joanitas and another guy who worked for the CIA in the Ambassador Hotel that night.
Right.
I knew that didn't make any sense because George Joanitas was like a Far East Coast operator working the Andy Castro Cuban group in Miami. Why would they bring him out to California when he was already part of the JFK assassination. In my mind, it made much more sense that they would use a West Coast team like Mayhew, people that were already out here and doing bad things out here. You don't need to fly in people because if they got exposed, it might expose the JFK case too. So I just thought that was weird. And I wrote an article attacking that, and Shane hated me ever since after I did that. but I ended up being right, because David Talbot and Jeff Morley both thought, well, what if Shane's right? We better look into this. And they did a real serious investigation, and they went and interviewed family members of Joanitas and this and that. He wasn't there. It wasn't him. He was elsewhere at the time, so I ended up being right, but it took those guys to prove it. But here's the other thing I want to say about photo identification. I've seen a photo of me from 1893. All right, it's obviously not me. I'm not that old.
Right.
But she looks exactly like I looked in my 20s. I mean, identical. If I put that side by side with other photos, you would think it was the same person. And when I went to summer camp, I went to Tanglewood summer camp many years ago, between junior and senior year of high school. And I was shocked by how many people I saw that looked just like people I knew out in California, but weren't the same person. So anybody who tries to do something with photo identification, I would be highly, highly skeptical. And I would especially be skeptical of those who say it's been digitally enhanced. When I hear those two words, I pretty much know they're faking it, because you can do anything with digital enhancement and make any face emerge. There's a blur in the back of the grassy knoll that, people have digitally enhanced now to look just like a policeman firing a gun. It's like, that's a stretch. That's a real stretch. It was just a blur. There may have been somebody there, but I don't buy those digital enhancements at all. And I would definitely not, one speaker at a conference says, well, I know this guy couldn't be the shooter because here's the photo of the shooter and it doesn't look like him. I'm like, we don't know what the shooter really looked like. That's a digital enhancement. So I would really encourage people, when you see films and videos and pictures, be super skeptical of that stuff. And especially now with AI. I mean, the digital fakes. Years ago, I wrote a script about this years ago, like in the early 2000s, the CIA already had technology where they could make it look like a foreign leader was telling a joke in a different language and move their lips exactly 100%. Correctly, and no 100%. One could tell the difference. So, I mean, this technology, again, has been around for like 25 years now. So do not trust your eyes. This is why I'm pretty much a documents person, especially original documents, not, stuff that shows up suddenly for the first time in, 2025, I like to look at what the record said then and see if it matches. If it matches, if it makes sense, then it fits into the puzzle. If it doesn't fit the puzzle, it's because it's not a real puzzle piece.
Man, there's so much that you've put me onto here. It's like really hurting my brain, but this is why I do it, because this is stuff that I could be aware of and interested in my whole life and still not. Like, it's so complex. It's so dense. There's so many details. And, that's why the work that you do is important. I also want to take a second to say, I love how savage you are on the internet. I love how savage you are on the internet.
It comes from those old conspiracy arguments.
Well, I was going to say, it kind of makes sense now that I know that context. But
5 years being trained by the CIA how to argue online. I feel like I have a PhD in this.
Top form. Yeah, exactly. Top form. Well, like you have, personally, I think anybody who's willing to go on the internet and voice their opinion and defend their opinion, that and put their face on it, that gets my respect.
Thank you.
I just love how you're never afraid to go toe to toe with nameless accounts who want to, it makes total sense now, though, knowing that you were up against literal CIA people in forums trying to talk you down and belittle you. It's like that asshole on the internet. That's not going to, it's not going to affect me.
I learned from the best. And like I said, if you play their attacks back on them because they think they work, they freak out.
Yeah.
Because it's like, I'm supposed to be doing that to her. She's not supposed to be doing that
but
to me.
it does. That's what's weird, and it's a weird psychological analysis. And again, it makes sense. That's what that organization does, and it's definitely something I picked up from reading all the books about hypnotism. It works on most people.
Yeah,
it works on most people.
80% of the people are to some degree hypnotizable. There's a scale that's widely accepted. It's a 5. It's a 1 to 5 scale. People at the 1 end cannot be hypnotized, but people at the 5 end can be played like a record player, basically, as Alan Dulles once said. They'll play any tune you want. And most, each of those numbers represents 20% of the population. So from the most hypnotizable at 5 to not being hypnotizable at all at 1. But that means from 2 to 5, again, 80% of the population is to some degree hypnotizable, which explains so much about why our politics are so broken. And it used to be illegal to propagandize the American public. It's not anymore. That law was, executive order wiped that away. I think it was Reagan who got rid of that. Yeah. And so when you hear stuff on the news, my first question is, I wonder if that's true. I don't ever accept anything as truth. I wonder if that's true. And when all the media are saying it at the same time, I'm especially suspicious, especially if it comes from the right and the left, because then it's coming from somewhere above.
Someone's lying. Yeah. Someone's lying here. Yeah.
But there are things that are true that, of course, everybody says too. So you can't say, well, because CBS said it, it can't be true. You can't do that. Or because Fox said it, it can't be true. You can't do that. It's not that simple. But if you pay attention and you look into things, and a lot of things can be independently verified these days. And especially, by the way, I'm going to just do a tiny rant on other JFK and RFK assassination researchers. Most people honestly aren't very good at it. They don't really understand it. They have a real point of view they're trying to push. Some of them, I think, are spooks trying to push an anybody but the CIA did it agenda. But some of them are just people who aren't critical thinkers, and they don't put facts together well. And I'm certainly not going to name any names because there's some really good researchers out there too. And I don't need to name those either because then you'll know who the other ones are, right? But just because it comes from a conspiracy researcher doesn't mean it's true. And just because it's printed in a nonfiction book or a news article doesn't mean it's true. I had a long argument with Aaron Good in email the other day because he's like, are you saying you know more than this reporter? And I'm like, yes, I am. I actually do know more. When it comes to this case, I know more than that reporter. And this is why he's wrong, And I was ultimately able to prove my case, but it's like, I call it lazy when people just quote a couple of sources or they find a document and they write about it. You need to know the context. You kind of need to know everything about it. It's one of the reasons I waited to write my book for so long. I've been studying this for 30 years. Yeah. I didn't start writing it until about 15 years in. And even then I kind of started and stopped. And then for 4 years I got really serious because I just have to do this. And I didn't want to write a book. I never wanted to be famous or anything. I just wanted people to understand our own history. I see history as our country's medical chart. And if we're thinking we have cancer, but we really have diabetes, we're not treating the right disease. And if we think the problem is Trump or Biden, we are not treating the disease.
Yeah, 100%.
There is so much more that is going on. And I think these cases give us a real window into the secret government, the parallel government, the deep state, whatever you want to call it, that you can't get anywhere else. Because we have the most document and records, and you start to see the patterns and how they are still echoing today.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. It's something I've gone on a million tirades on this show. To me, especially the modern political landscape is just sports. And what serves the powers that be greater? Us bickering with each other over minutia, or us digging into the actual verifiable history of corrupt activity on behalf of corporations in our government? What benefits them more, folks? So, this is why I think what you do is important. This is why I appreciate what you do, and I love watching you duke it out with folks on X, the lawless landscape that X has become. Because it's just, it's valuable. This is a time, we talked about AI, but like more so than ever, we need people critically thinking about the information that they're coming across. Like it's
question everything. And especially, like I said, in documents, don't assume that it's true. Question everything. I actually, as I approach like new files in JFK, I assume everything is false, doctored, inserted, unless it has a verifiable chain of command to the National Archives. Because these documents appear over time, Operation Zipper, and, people insert a lot of fake stuff into the record. And don't buy any of that. If you can't verify the chain of possession on that document, assume it's a fake. If somebody tells me something, I can't tell you how many people have called me over the years like, I know who the girl in the polka dot dress is. And I used to actually give them a lot of time.
Entertain it.
Give them an hour or two to explain their theory or why. And they never panned out. So now I just don't do it. It's just such a waste of time. And everybody is so convinced that they're right and I'm wrong. But it's like, I've read so many reports of the girl. I know how she has to look because it's all over the LAPD files. And it's like, if she doesn't have a turned up nose and a really curvy figure and a bubble butt, it's not her, So, yeah.
I just imagine you looking at pictures of these people's friends just judging them. No, butt's not big enough. No, I'm sorry. Her nose isn't curled enough. Sorry. This ain't her.
Well, if a girl has a pretty straight nose, it's hard to say she has a funny turned up Bob Hope.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Nose. Come on,
Exactly.
Oh, boy.
They're just hoping. Love it. Well, Lisa, thank you so much for joining me on this and really taking me down the rabbit hole here. I'm just going to share this again. And of course, I will include these links in the description. You can find Lisa all day, every day, taking on the haters on X at Lisa Pease. And then, of course, the book, Lie, Too Big to Fail, paperback comes out July 1st with the addendum and the other editions that you were talking about throughout the course of the podcast. Thank you so much again. Is there any closing thoughts you want to leave the audience with?
Thank you for your service and what you are doing to help educate the masses onto how the world really works. That's super important, and I really respect that. And thank you for having me on.
Well, I really appreciate that. Folks, this has been the Totally Legitimate Business Podcast, and we'll catch you on the next one. Thank you.
This has been the Totally Legitimate Business Podcast. The end. With your host, James Oliva. Executive producers, Clint G and James Oliva. That's obnoxious. Sound design, mix, and master by James Oliva. Literally no one cares. For more Totally Legitimate Business, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Totally Legitimate Business or add us on TikTok at TLB Pod. When will this end? Thank you for listening. Now get back to work. Move it along, buddy.